So that is kind of the outcome, the only outcome in which the Russian armed forces are sufficiently degraded that any treaty that is signed becomes enforceable merely by the fact that there is no way that Russia can violate it anymore. Russia cannot, is physically, or at least using military jargon, kinetically, makes it kinetically impossible for Russia to invade Ukraine again.
When the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Welcome to the second edition of Debunking Tankies, and this time we have maybe not a tankie specifically, but definitely the king of campists himself, Noam Chomsky. What do I mean by campist? The term campist basically refers to people who, throughout the Cold War and after the Cold War, believed that the world was basically split into two camps. One which was the West, the other which was, at least now, the rest. And because the West is the biggest evil, thanks to their support of capitalism and imperialism, then it naturally follows that the rest are good, insofar as they are fighting against Western hegemony. Now, you can see what's very problematic about this worldview, in that it basically makes you quite willing to excuse some of the most horrible war crimes, atrocities, human rights abuses, even genocide and wars of aggression and invasions by countries that are not in the Western orbit, because in your mind, you think that all of this serves a grander narrative of weakening the West and is therefore the lesser evil. Unsurprisingly, campists have largely supported Russia during this war, usually with the caveat of, well, I don't really like Putin, but, you know, NATO is the biggest existential threat, etc., etc., etc. And they end up repeating the same Russian propaganda, the same excuses that you hear over and over and over again to justify the invasion that tankies use. Tankies obviously doing it much more overtly. So in a practical sense, there's not much difference between the campists and the tankies. The only one is really that the tankies are just completely shameless in their propaganda in favor of Russia, whereas the campists try and give a more nuanced intellectual argument. But it's still the same thing, and it deserves to be debunked. So let's start with this video with Noam Chomsky and Vijay Prashad, who is the co-author of Chomsky's most recent book. And this is from Democracy Now!, a channel which I thought was quite good. Certainly when it comes to covering things, you know, the bad things that countries like the US or Israel do, it's very good. For the Ukraine war, I think it's been a bit of a mixed bag. I wouldn't say it's as bad as like Jacobin or Current Affairs, which are fully in the campus camp, so to speak. But definitely they've had a mixed coverage. They've had people like Timothy Snyder on, which is one of the better voices of understanding the situation in between Ukraine and Russia. At least one of the better voices in the English-speaking world. He's a very good author. But on the other hand, you have videos like this, which are basically just campus propaganda. So let's do a deep dive and debunk all the factual inaccuracies and misleading statements by Chomsky and Prashad.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We continue our conversation with Vijay Prashad and Professor Noam Chomsky, who've co-authored the new book, The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power. Juan Gonzalez and I spoke to them Friday, just as the Russian President Vladimir Putin was holding a signing ceremony to mark the annexation of 4 areas of occupied Ukraine. Later that day, Ukraine would apply for NATO membership. I asked Professor Chomsky about U.S. media coverage of the Ukraine war and how it's getting it wrong.
To begin with, suggest considerable measure of caution with the way things are being reported in the United States. To take one quite significant case, there's been a large amount of, you can say, euphoria over the claim that major countries in the world, or a very important country of the global south, of course, it's claimed that Modi president of India, censured Putin at a meeting in Samarkand, where he told Putin that India does not support the Russian position. If you look, I took the trouble of looking this up on the Indian government official website. What happened is quite different. The Western propaganda has seized upon half a dozen words in which Modi said, war is not the answer. And that was taken to be a break with Russia. If you read the rest of the text, it's practically a love letter to Putin about how wonderful our relations are and how they'll get even better and how supportive we are of you and so on. That part was left out of, which is practically the whole message, was left out of the Western reporting, of the US reporting. So you have to be.
Okay, so let's understand what he's doing here. The first thing he's doing is, well, I'm going to pick this one instance of this largely irrelevant bit of news to suggest that the US or Western media is basically just lying about everything. So he does this, and a lot of leftists do this, and they end up with the worldview where just none of the mainstream media can be trusted. And if you think about it, it's exactly the same as what the right has done as well. For example, on COVID. So they find something that the mainstream media has lied about, and there's plenty there, and then just naturally conclude from that everything they say is false. And sadly, a lot of leftists, especially in the anti-war, anti-imperialist left sub-grouping, are not very smart. That's really, I hate to say this, but they're not very smart, and they're as not smart as a lot of people on the far right who also use, the QAnon conspiracy theorists, the COVID deniers, etc. Kind of the same thing on our side, but that's really it. Now, the second thing he's trying to do is basically suggest that actually most of the global South does not support Ukraine or doesn't want this war or whatever. And again, this is very strange. So Modi basically said that he would rather there not be this war. Not exactly his words, but sort of hinting to Putin, dude, you're pushing it. And it doesn't matter that he subsequently praised him for whatever length of his statement. Countries like India have diplomatically have a difficult task of juggling what is essentially a strategic relationship with Russia in many respects, whether it's military, whether it's economic, etc., while at the same time being opposed to what Russia is doing. So usually the solution to that when it comes to international affairs is that if there is a controversial voting in the UN, you simply abstain or you simply act neutral. Neutrality here is really a disguised way of saying we oppose this war, we oppose what you're doing, but we don't want to ruin our relationship with you, so we're going to just pretend that this isn't happening. And if you think about it, if you look at the votes, very few countries openly support Russia in this. So this is the March vote on condemning Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. And if you look at it, there's only a handful of countries that voted no, including Russia itself. So no as in not condemn Russia. That was North Korea, Syria, Belarus, and Eritrea for some strange reason. But even other very strong allies like Nicaragua and Venezuela apparently didn't also voted to abstain. So obviously the big ones are China and India here. And so this has been used as an argument by people like Chomsky and others from the left, saying well, the majority of the population, the global South, which, just India and China together account for a big chunk of that, are actually not in support of NATO. Well, you can also argue they're not in support of Russia, which is far more believable. And they're just trying to save face in terms of maintaining their existing diplomatic relationships with Russia. That is what they're doing. And you can see it when it happens on the flip side. So a good example is the recent vote in the UN on ending the US embargo on Cuba, which has overwhelming international support. So only the US and Israel voted against this against this motion to end. So they're in favor of the embargo. But notice there's one country that abstained, and that is Ukraine and Bolsonaro's Brazil. So again, Bolsonaro's Brazil, broadly speaking, in the US camp, but also doesn't want to really abandon its kind of pretenses of Latin American leadership. So it's going to abstain. And Ukraine is obviously a country that right now depends, its war effort depends in terms of the material support, that depends entirely on the US. So clearly this is not a relationship that it wants to impair in any possible way. Cuba is really not an issue that I think most Ukrainians care about. There's very little in terms of trade, I suppose, between Ukraine and Cuba. So what do? Rather than take a vote that condemns its ally, well, just abstains. But it's clear that there's no stomach on the Ukrainian side to openly support the embargo. So my point is, this is why countries abstain from voting. But Noam Chomsky is sort of trying to make you think that all these people, and the only countries that the countries that don't openly support the US or don't offer direct military assistance or openly support NATO or whatever, only the ones that do that are the ones that are siding with Ukraine. And that's not the case. I suspect the majority of countries, the majority of governments on the planet, again, aside from the small number of countries that are in the Russian orbit, all of them are against this war, and all of them would have loved to condemn this invasion were it not for a fact that they have some strategic relationship with Russia that they want to preserve.
It's one example of many of considerable care that has to be taken. Fact is that internationally, at least, the United States and Britain are pretty isolated on this. Europe is sort of going along, but the population is not supportive of that position. As I mentioned, over the most important country, Germany, over 3/4 is in favor of moving to negotiations right away. Same in Slovakia. President Macron of France, who's been the most dedicated to seeking to find a negotiated settlement, has recently reiterated his belief that the prospects diminish as the war continues. There are still openings. The United States and Britain, it's lackey at this point, are pretty much isolated in their commitment to continuing the war, whatever the effects, in order to severely weaken Russia.
Well, I don't know what polls he is cherry picking for this, but in fact, that is not the case. Here is a recent survey that was quoted in The Guardian by a YouGov Cambridge globalism project. Now, I tried to find the data for this, but it appears they haven't really published it. This seems to be like some kind of advanced note. But there is overwhelming support in the West for maintaining the current policies. So you can see here, a lot of countries, Denmark, Sweden, Spain, Australia, huge support for maintaining economic sanctions. Obviously, these drop in a lot of non-Western countries, which again, may be benefiting from some or depend on Russia for certain things. Could be food, could be fertilizer, could be whatever, oil, other energy. But yeah, willingness to maintain sanctions. But right now we're just focusing on the Western sentiments, which is what Noam Chomsky is trying to claim are not as strong. Willingness to maintain sanctions, yeah, most of them are, even in the face of living cost increases. Support for sending light and heavy weapons for Ukraine. Poland, Denmark, Sweden, UK, Australia. Yeah, that's pretty strong. Most of these other countries aren't spending weapons. But yeah, among the Western countries, it is very strong. So Noam Chomsky is objectively wrong about this. He is lying to you. Yeah, willingness to recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea if Russia stopped fighting and gave up all other territory gained during war. This is impressive because even in the third world countries, there is very little support for this. So You know, no, I think most people see this as blatant Russian aggression. I think most people see this as an illegal takeover of Ukrainian land. So, yeah. Again, there's a difference between kind of the involvement that a lot of global South countries believe is appropriate, and most of them aren't supporting the war in any, you know, material sense. But still, what he's saying about Western sentiment is wrong, categorically wrong.
Are there still negotiation possibilities? There's only one way to find out. That's to try. If you refuse to try, of course, there's no option, no possibilities.
Okay, you know what I'm going to do now, right? You all know what I'm going to do about it. You've seen this in numerous videos. Whenever someone says that the US or the West or Ukraine should negotiate with Russia, need to answer two questions. The first one is, how are they going to get Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table when he has explicitly said that he is not interested in negotiating? And two, what assurance do you have that anything that Putin signs regarding Ukraine is something that he or Russia in general is going to uphold and respect? And the answer is there isn't. So the only possibility for negotiations that are satisfactory to Ukraine's interests is if Ukraine has such an either recovers its territory militarily or leads to the Russian armed forces being so significantly degraded that they have no choice but to sue for peace. And that would be an outcome similar to what happened in World War I, where the German army was still occupying most of Belgium and parts of France by the time of the armistice. But it was pretty obvious that they had been defeated. And if the war had dragged on for another couple of months, you would have had the Allies at the Rhine at some point. So that is kind of the outcome, the only outcome in which the Russian armed forces are sufficiently degraded that any treaty that is signed becomes enforceable merely by the fact that there is no way that Russia can violate it anymore. Russia cannot, is physically, or at least using military jargon, kinetically, makes it kinetically impossible for Russia to invade Ukraine again. That is the only way.
There's so little reporting about this in the United States that one can say little with confidence, but we do have credible information that there were Russia-Ukraine negotiations under Turkish auspices in April, which may have been getting somewhere. As soon as they were announced, Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of England, flew to Ukraine and apparently informed Ukraine that the West, meaning the United States and Britain, would not favor negotiations. He was followed directly by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin.
Okay, this is a good one that we need to debunk. So there is a claim repeated by almost all the campists and all the tankies that Boris Johnson flew to Kiev in April and told Zelensky that they would no longer support Ukraine if they sued for peace. And that has been disproven now for months, but they keep repeating this. So their source was a claim by a Ukrainian newspaper called Pravda. But unfortunately, Pravda subsequently published a more extensive analysis of the peace negotiations that were going on, which indeed they were. So that part is true. What's false is that Boris Johnson scuppered the plans himself by this surprise visit to Kiev. So he wants to present this unannounced visit as being incredibly mysterious and conspirational. The fact is, most of Western leaders who visited Ukraine during those early months did it unannounced for obvious security reasons. I mean, Kiev was still, to this moment, it's still part of the war zone. You don't want a situation in which Russia knows that a major Western leader is in town where they can maybe lob a missile or two. So this has all been, all those visits by Boris Johnson, by other leaders, have been unannounced for obvious reasons. So there's nothing mysterious about that. Now, why did Boris Johnson go to Kiev so many times? Well, It's obvious why. At the time, Boris Johnson was embroiled in a massive domestic scandal, which was the Partygate scandal. He was sinking in the polls. There were calls to replace him. And every time that he went to Ukraine, it was basically as a photo op. And, you know, a reminder, this was the heat of the peak of the Partygate scandal was in late March. So it's not surprising that after the police itself was involved in this scandal, he would, okay, how do I deflect from this? Let's go to Kiev and act the Churchillian war hero. That's what he was always doing. That was the whole point of his visits. There was nothing mysterious about this, no conspiracy here. Now let's look at the report from Pravda. And it's a pretty long article. I'm going to link it in the description. But I'm going to go to the part that is directly related to what Boris Johnson was doing there. And this is basically what happened. Johnson brought two simple messages to Kyiv. Putin is a war criminal. He should be suppressed, not negotiated with. And secondly, if you are ready to sign any agreements on guarantees with him, then we are not. We can with you, but not with him. He will still abandon everyone. One of Zelensky's close associates summarizes the essence of Johnson's visit. So, this is not a statement that says that Boris Johnson scuppered peace talks. What he basically is doing here is telling Ukraine that whatever you sign with Russia, we're not going to guarantee it. We're not going to sign it either. And this is in many ways kind of a parallel to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which Russia violated in 2014 by invading Crimea. And that memorandum, as well as a Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation that they signed in 1997, both stated that Russia was to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine as per the 1991 borders. Now, in the Budapest Memorandum, that was signed by both Russia, the US, and the UK. So in some respects, they were guaranteeing that Ukraine's territory would be respected. This is not like an open statement that they would go to war in case they wouldn't. But it is a statement that they were upholding that treaty. So what is Johnson doing here? What he's saying is basically, we're not going to sign another Budapest Memorandum. We're not going to put our country's signature on something that Putin, who we fundamentally distrust, we believe will end up violating. So that's it. That's the story. It's not, and it's clear. He says, we are ready to sign with you. So they'll sign any agreement that is needed with Ukraine, but they won't do it with Russia. This has nothing to do with scuppering a peace agreement. And again, the campist view here, and what Noam Chomsky and all these others have consistently been trying to do, is to get the US to go over Ukraine and sign some sort of agreement with Russia, which actually is a manifestation of US imperialism, that the US, who isn't fighting, they're not the ones who are dying on the battlefields, that they're the ones that should go and negotiate peace with Russia is unbelievable. Like, it's unbelievably disrespectful to the sacrifice that Ukrainians are doing and to the agency that Ukraine as a country has. But most campists don't believe that any country has agency. That's why they always believe that everything that happens in this world can be blamed on the US or on the West. No other country has agency. And this particular talking point that he's using is a direct manifestation of that. And it's a very insulting aspect of campism, this belief that no other country has their destiny in their hands, because everything in the end, whatever positive things they do are going to be undone by a CIA coup. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous.
Who presumably gave the message that it is he's repeated over and over, and that is now official U.S. policy, that the war must continue to weaken Russia severely, and it follows that no time for negotiations. Well, none of this can be said with certainty because there is so little commentary and reporting, and what there is often highly distorted, as in the important example that I just gave. But the fact is that sooner or later, there will have to be some kind of negotiated settlement unless one side or the other just capitulates. That's virtually logic.
No, it's not virtually logic. He and many other campists have been arguing this, that the war will only end until either by negotiation or until one side surrenders. And that's not necessarily the case. Like I said, you can reach an agreement by which one side has basically all the momentum for the war progressing favorably on its side, forcing the other, not forcing, but basically telling the other side, look, you're not going to win this. You're not going to hold on to these territories. You've lost. Sue for peace. And you have no way of really beating us in the near future. That is, for me, the conditions by which an actual negotiation can take place. And most Ukrainians support this. Most Ukrainians, the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians, want Ukraine to continue fighting until Russia is driven out of their land. And that includes not just the Donbass, but also Crimea. So I say, let the Ukrainians decide until when the war is over.
If the longer the war goes on, the longer it's maintained, the more the prospects for a diplomatic settlement diminish.
That's actually, this is like almost a complete perversion of the laws of physics of warfare. The longer a war lasts, the more likely there is going to be peace, because the more likely both sides will get degraded by the conflict. I don't know any circumstance in which the more the war lasts, the less likely peace is. That's not how wars work, Noam. But he doesn't know much about wars, to be honest. I mean, if you've read his stuff in the past, and this is a problem with a lot of leftists that I have, is that they fundamentally have not read anything about war, fundamentally do not understand how war works, and that completely delegitimizes a lot of opinions that they have on foreign policy and conflict.
Almost automatic. So before the invasion, there seemed to be pretty good prospects for a settlement, or more or less in the framework of the Minsk Agreement, under the auspices of France and Germany, to which Russia and Ukraine theoretically accepted, though didn't implement it. The U.S. role was, to put it mildly, not constructive in that respect. It's an understatement. As the war continued, prospects do diminish, but they're still there. Late March, President Zelensky produced some proposals which are not very far from the Macron proposals for settlement. Didn't get anywhere. There was the April case. We don't know what's happening since. The longer the war persists, the more destruction and devastation there will be, the more...
Caused by Russia. He will never say this. He wants to make it seem that the violence and the destruction are just organic or caused by both sides. The overwhelming devastation of Ukraine is being caused by Russia, and he should have the balls to say it. And it's morally reprehensible that he doesn't.
What's called collateral damage elsewhere. Massive starvation because of the closing off of Black Sea exports. There's some relaxation of that, but we have little information about it. Threat of nuclear war increases, and perhaps most significantly of all, and least discussed, is the fact that as the war continues, the limited efforts to deal with the overwhelming crisis of climate destruction, those reverse. Instead of moving to limit fossil fuels, what's happening?
Maybe Russia should just not have invaded Ukraine for none of this to happen. It doesn't say that, does he? Maybe we should support Ukraine so that it wins the war as quick as possible, so we limit the damage to the environment. He doesn't argue that. Everything that happens in Chomsky's world is the fault of no one else but the West. And that is what's so despicable about him. And now he's going to go on a minutes-long rant on, the evils of climate change, which, obviously are real, but in the context of what we're discussing here, are irrelevant. So I'm just going to, speed this bit up and wait until Vijay's turn to speak comes up.
Is expansion of fossil fuel production, exuberance in the offices of ExxonMobil, Chevron, and the rest, opening new fields for development, expansion of reduction of restrictions, search for new sources of oil. Some of what's happening is, this means basically the end of organized human life on Earth. We're not talking about something minor. We have a narrow window in which the severe problems of heating the climate can be dealt with. As you close that window more and more, the less are the chances of survival of organized human life on Earth. That's what we're facing. As I say, sometimes...
So Ukraine needs to surrender, so that doesn't happen, right? Genius logic. I am a linguist, and I know everything.
What's happening is simply surreal. You hardly can find words to describe it. Take just the last couple of weeks, new scientific reports appeared with regard to the Eastern Mediterranean, not very far from Ukraine. They found that projections about what was going to happen in the region were way off, much too conservative. Now, new studies indicate that by the end of the century, heating in the Eastern Mediterranean region will be about twice as high as what was thought before, 5 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That's right at the level, it reaches the level of survival. And of course, it doesn't stop there. Meanwhile, Israeli climatologists are quite good, discovered that their own projections of rise in sea level were way off. They were dire enough. It turns out they were far from accurate. It's going to be much worse than that. They predict that by mid-century, there will be a meter of sea level rise. The end of the century, maybe 2 to 2.5 meters. The effects are indescribable. You think about that for the countries there, Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, can't even describe it. Meanwhile, what's happening? Israel and Lebanon are squabbling over who will have the right to administer the coup de grace. Literally, they're squabbling over who will control the fossil fuel resources on their maritime border. So who, in other words, will have the opportunity to destroy the two countries while they sink underwater. That's what's happening before our eyes. Other areas of the world as well. Going back to Ukraine, the longer the war continues, the more the window closes. We move towards increasing fossil fuel production when we must be minimizing, ending them quickly. That's the situation that we are facing. Meanwhile, going back to Ukraine, the United States and Britain, following along obediently, are keeping to the principle that the war must continue to severely weaken Russia, meaning no negotiated settlements, with all the consequences that follow. That's what should be uppermost in our minds, not only because of its significance, but because of all the factors involved in this complex affair. That's the one that we have a possibility of influence. We can't influence what happens in the Kremlin. We can influence what happens in the United States. Again.
Okay, so this is a talking point that he gives all the time when he's asked, like, well, why don't you criticize the actions of Russia or China or Syria or Iran, whatever? And he always says this, and a lot of leftists always do it as well. And it's like, well, we're U.S. citizens, or we're citizens of the West. We have no influence in what other countries do. Well, there's two things that are worth pointing out here. The first is Noam Chomsky, above anyone else for the past 60 years or more, has argued that both of the main parties in the US, the Democrats and the Republicans, are fundamentally the same. That is sort of the argument that made him famous when he was arguing this in the 60s. That both parties represented the interests of capital and the military-industrial complex, etc., and that there were no fundamental differences between the two aside from marginal elements. So if you look at how the Chomskyites and a lot of the campists talk about domestic politics in the U.S., you get that same sense. I mean, a lot of them have been fooled into this idea that, well, now the Republican Party is the anti-war party, and God knows how many ended up voting Republican in the midterms or in 2024. So, you know, these people, like I said at the beginning, are not very smart. That's a fact. They're not very smart. Their brains are not very capable of nuanced thought. And, you know, you read that both parties are kind of the same, then yeah, you think they're both the same, and nothing will change. So what's the point of putting pressure on a democratic administration to do something about Ukraine versus a Republican one? Kind of the same, isn't it? According to them. And the flip side of this is that they also believe that the US is in control of everything else that happens in the world. So, well, if the US is so influential, and basically every other country in the global south, at least, is controlled by the State Department, well, then maybe US citizens do have some say in what other countries do, right? I don't know. It just never made it. It seems to me like this is an argument that's just one giant cop-out from refusing to criticize other governments and just limiting your criticism to the US by just saying, well, I'm just a citizen here. This is the only country that I can influence, when everything else he says about the country makes you think that you have no influence and that your vote doesn't matter.
That should be uppermost in our minds.
Vijay, Prashad, I wanted to ask you in terms, not only in terms of the war in Ukraine.
Okay, so before we go on to Vijay, I think Noam Chomsky is awful. I think he is a disgrace to the left. I don't think he deserves half the adoration that he has as a leading leftist intellectual. But Vijay Prashad is deranged, like totally deranged. If I'm being generous to Chomsky and describing him as a campist, I would definitely call Vijay a tanky, or at least closer to tanky than campist, and you will hear why.
Ukraine, but your book deals with interventions of the U.S. Your new book, Interventions of the U.S. Throughout the World, Afghanistan, Syria. Can you talk about, here we have a situation where less than about 6 months after the U.S. exit from Afghanistan and supposedly the end of our forever wars, we're embroiled now in the funding and financing of yet another conflict that is shaking the world. Most Americans don't realize most of this aid money is only going to buy weapons from the U.S. war industry. And of course, we have on the horizon the next conflict.
So two factual inaccuracies. Actually, a lot of the aid, most of the aid that the U.S. is providing Ukraine is non-military. So that is, a lot of this is fiscal resources so that the Ukrainian economy can keep on running. Now, in terms of the aid, the military aid that the U.S. is giving Ukraine, a lot of this is being given, dare I say almost all of it is given as Lend-Lease, which is, if you recall from World War II studies, Lend-Lease is basically a program in which the U.S. gives weapons to an ally, lends them essentially, and they only have to pay it back at the end of the war if they want to keep it, or else they give it back. And if it gets destroyed, then it doesn't matter. So in theory, when you hear like the U.S. has given $1 billion or 10 billion in military aid to Ukraine, all that means is that's the quantity of the weapon, the value of the weapons that the U.S. is supplying Ukraine. It doesn't mean that there was an economic exchange that took place, because those weapons were not sold, nor were they bought. They already existed. They had already been paid for. A lot of these are weapons that the U.S. had not planned to use ever again, like M113 APCs, some other stuff. I mean, obviously there's newer weaponry like javelins, etc. But a lot of this is equipment that the U.S. already had in storage and probably was never going to use again. Now, to be fair, it's not to say that this money or this transaction doesn't exist, in the sense that the U.S. in future military budgets is going to want to replace those weapons, possibly with more of the same, or possibly with new ones. So the U.S. gives $10 billion in weapons to Ukraine. Maybe there's no economic transaction in the immediate sense, but the U.S. will maybe want to hike up its military budget by 10 or more next year to make up for the weapons that it's been giving away. And especially in things like artillery shells, etc., that the U.S. will probably want to replenish them. So on that point, there is, I would say, some kind of spending going on. But they're still being very disingenuous in this.
With China, talk about this forever war mentality of the United States and the influence of the Pentagon on how the media portrays many of these conflicts.
Juan, let's just look at some numbers first. Last year, the calculation was that the world's powers spend $2 trillion, that's with a T, on weapons. The United States by itself spends nearly $1 trillion. If you add the money in the Department of Energy budget for nuclear weapons and so on, $1 trillion, $2 trillion globally. Meanwhile, the total budget for the United Nations is $3 billion. That's with a B. We spend trillions of dollars on weapons and only low billions on peace building. It's extraordinary. I mean, I want more people to know about these numbers.
I also want people to know the numbers on how much the US is actually spending on Ukraine. And the actual military aid to Ukraine is equivalent to, drumroll, just 3.6% of the defense budget. Not 3.6% of GDP, which would be a huge number. No. And not 3.6% of the budget. No, just 3.6% of the defense budget is has been given in terms of military aid to Ukraine. And that is much lower than what many other European countries have given. Countries like Estonia, for example, or Poland have given, even the UK, I think, has given more. Proportionally to their budgets than the US has. So this has been a remarkably cheap war for the US, remarkably cheap. I do agree that there is an element of the US wanting to weaken Russia significantly, and this is like the perfect scenario for this, because American soldiers are not dying. And they're basically just spending so far 3.6% of their budget to defeat the second most powerful military on the planet. I mean, you can't dream this up, to be honest. But still, the idea that this is like just a horrifically expensive war for the US taxpayer is ludicrous. Ludicrous statement.
There's a habit of war making. Look, you can't take out Ukraine, lift it out of the earth and put it in Iowa. Ukraine is going to have to live next to Russia. It's going to have to live there. That's where it is. The Ukrainians and the Russians have to come to some kind of agreement.
Great. So let's come to an agreement after the Russian military has been so weakened that it cannot hope to invade Ukraine, at least for another generation. How about we do that? I think that's more sensible than this idea that, well, you know, to live together, you just have to give me 20% of your land. I mean, this is, if you think about it, this is the language of the abuser. This is like, you know, you have to live in this house, honey. You know, I might beat you every fortnight, but you still have to live here. It's where your kids are. You can't go. This is the language of abuse, and it's despicable. It's morally depraved that you hear it from leftists, supposed leftists. Like I said, this guy's a tanky. This guy's a tanky.
The kind of way in which the rhetoric in this war has accelerated, going back to 2014, that rhetorical acceleration is something that even the Ukrainians rejected when Volodymyr Zelensky came before them in the election. Because after all, Mr. Zelensky came to office vowing to make a peace agreement with the Russians, because even he recognizes Ukraine has to live next to Russia. But the United States saw Ukraine as a kind of loose nail under which they placed their weapons. Billions of dollars of weapons, much more than the annual budget of the United Nations.
Okay, this is an absolutely horrendous statement to make. I'm going to explain why. What he's basically saying is that Zelensky came to office on the promise of making peace, but the U.S. used him to start, to start this war. Basically, the U.S. provoked Russia into starting this war. So poor Zelensky, he was just a pawn in American geopolitical interests. This is ridiculous. So first and foremost, Zelensky came to power, and he indeed promised that he was going to work with Russia to achieve peace. Remember, the Donbass war had been going on. It was a frozen conflict by then. There was no apparent solution to it. He came to power promising peace. And Zelensky did not want war. Ukraine didn't want war. I mean, Ukraine would, like, if you go back in time and you told Ukrainians, even if they win this war, if you go back in time and you told Ukrainians, would you had rather this war just not happened? Most would have said yes. You know, you'd rather not have your country devastated. You would rather not have your loved ones killed. You wouldn't want to live under the terror of drone attacks at night, artillery attacks at random moments during the day. You wouldn't want to go through that. So Ukraine didn't want war. But now that there is war, they damn right want to win it. And I think the least they deserve is all the assistance in doing that, because otherwise the sacrifice would have been in vain. Especially if there is a negotiation which Russia ends up with Ukrainian territory. It was all for what? But what he's saying here, which is so despicable, is that somehow either Zelensky was lying and he secretly wanted war and conspired with the US to provoke Russia into invading, or that the US used Ukraine, took advantage of this, and pumped Ukraine full of weapons, which provoked Russia into invading. This is a despicable argument. Like, this guy's a piece of shit. Like, a morally depraved piece of shit. There's just no nice way of describing this.
In order to egg Russia on. And by the way, it's...
So he even admits it, to egg Russia on. He's admitting that this war was caused by US provocation. And that's exactly what Noam Chomsky has said as well. He has been open in saying that NATO provoked this war, which again is the language of the abuser. It's the language of, well, she was wearing that dress, that's why she got raped. Same thing, because provocation needs to be justified. You know, I can say that anyone who looks at me in a pub is worthy of me punching them because they provoked me into punching them. Well, that's ridiculous, obviously, because by no account, like, no sensible person would say that just looking at someone makes them deserve getting punched. So, you know, provocation is in the eye of the beholder, and there's no reason, like, if Russia says we were provoked by NATO, there's no reason to justify that provocation was real. But for them, that's all that matters. They will take whatever Russia says and believe it.
It's not just a matter of Ukraine and Russia coming to some understanding, because they do have to live next to each other. And as Noam was saying, in April of this year, they had an interim agreement which looked a lot like Minsk II. But the West said no. The point, as U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said, is to weaken Russia. You see, the question isn't Ukraine and Russia by itself. It's also the United States and Russia. So when the United States withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Force Range Treaty in 2019, that was the end, basically, of most of the arms control treaties between the United States and Russia. In fact, since 2019, we're living without a security guarantee arrangement between these major nuclear powers, the United States and Russia. No wonder that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has brought the doomsday clock to within 100 seconds of midnight. You know, it began at 7 minutes to midnight. We are now at 100 seconds. And the reason the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists gives for this is the unilateral withdrawal by the United States from basically the entire architecture of arms control, with Russia in particular.
So this is again false. So what Trump did was he withdrew the US from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. What is this treaty? This treaty sets limits, or rather bans, the development and deployment of medium range nuclear missiles. So anything between, I think, 500 kilometers and 5,000-ish kilometer range. Why? Because if these were deployed in Europe, this was like a late Cold War debate. If these were deployed in Europe, it would give very little time for any reaction against them. So basically, most of Western Russia and most of Europe would be annihilated in a matter of seconds. So these were banned by this treaty. Now, Trump withdrew from this treaty, and I think he shouldn't. Obviously, I think any treaty that limits nuclear weapons is good. the excuse that Trump gave was that Russia was violating this treaty by developing some variants of its Iskander missile, which you've probably heard of, which they've used quite extensively in this war, including, so according to Russia, these didn't have more than 500-kilometer range. The US claimed that they did. Who knows? I would not be surprised if Russia was sneakily violating this treaty. Nothing that Putin does surprises me. But I don't think the US should have withdrawn from this treaty. And it also follows, the US withdrawal from another main treaty, which was the Iran nuclear deal. So this was all done under Trump. But this is not to say that the entire architect of arms control has been, that the US has destroyed it, because actually there is the New START treaty, which was actually extended the year before the war in Ukraine started. So this one is arguably the more important one, because this one involves, the number of total warheads. These are the ones that will destroy the world if it comes to that. So this idea that the entire architecture of nuclear arms control is gone is patently not true, though, like I said, the US has withdrawn from a treaty that it shouldn't have. Now, the other thing that he's basically making an analogy of withdrawing from these treaties and kind of hinting that, Russia has also violated treaties like the Budapest Memorandum, but then the US has also withdrawn from these treaties. It's kind of not the same if you think about it. Any country is allowed to withdraw from a treaty, and the US announced that it was withdrawing from these treaties. So it was perfectly legal for them to do so. The equivalent to this, to what Russia has done with, for example, the Budapest Memorandum, where they invaded Ukraine in 2014 and then said, actually that treaty isn't valid. What the equivalent to this would be if the US deployed an intermediate range nuclear missile, dropped it on Russia, fired it on Russia, and then said, actually the treaty is invalid now. That's the equivalent. So there is no direct analogy between the US withdrawing from these treaties versus Russia violating all the security arrangements that it had with Ukraine, which he's kind of implying.
So there's got to be pressure on the Biden administration, not only to back off and allow Zelensky and Putin to talk, to allow them to have some kind of peace agreement that's, with dignity for all sides, but also the United States needs to go back to the table with the Russians and talk to them. If the United States can talk to the Saudis, in fact, pal up with the Saudis, why can't they talk to the Russians? It's ridiculous to say, the Russians are not going to, they're not a good partner, they're not going to live on agreements and so on. Look who's talking. The United States is the country that unilaterally walked away from the Iran nuclear deal. Not the Iranians, it was the United States.
Again, just so that it's clear, it is not the same to say that you are going to withdraw from a treaty, announce it publicly, than do what the treaty said you couldn't do, and then say that the treaty is invalid, which is what Russia has done. So the US was perfectly free to walk out of the Iran nuclear deal. Was it a good thing? Of course not. Of course not. I think that deal was one of the few really good things that Obama managed to do. But that is not the same. Russia didn't say that they were going to withdraw from the Budapest Memorandum, which would have immediately been a red flag for Ukraine, obviously. No, they invaded Ukraine when the treaty was still valid, and then said, you know what, actually, it's invalid. So he is being a very disingenuous hack here. And he's definitely trying to make an analogy of something the US did, which, though bad, was not illegal, versus what Russia did, which was blatantly illegal.
bit rum to now say that, well, the Russians are not a reliable negotiating partner. At least try it. You know, for God's sake, for the sake of humanity, we need these major powers with a lot of firepower in their pocket to talk to each other. You can't turn to the United Nations and say, will you do something? As I said, the UN budget is $3 billion. You've got to strengthen peace building in the world and weaken war making. That has to be part of the commitment of sensitive people around the planet, whether in Russia, in Ukraine, the United States, certainly in the United Kingdom.
You both talk about allowing Russia and Ukraine to negotiate, but how does one do that? And talk about exactly what the U.S. can do now, Professor Chomsky.
What the U.S. can do is stop acting to prevent negotiations.
But it's not doing that. It's not doing that. Russia does not want to negotiate, and the U.S. does not need to be the country that pushes for these negotiations, because it is not one of the parties in the conflict that's actually fighting. So during the previous video of Debunking Tankies, in the debate between Brianna Joy Gray and Joe Siricione, Joe made a very good analogy of this, which was the Revolutionary War in the US. What if France had gone over George Washington and negotiated directly with Britain to end the war and signed a peace treaty that ended up with the US losing some territory just for the sake of peace? This would have been rightfully seen as a massive backstab by the Americans, by George Washington. You know, how dare France sign a peace treaty with our enemy without our input, without our knowledge? And that war was just as much a geopolitical war between two big powers, France and Britain, as it was just a war between the US and Britain, which France was directly assisting in. So, yeah, he just has no idea how these negotiations can take place.
For a long time, there's no time to review the record, but the position of the United States has been to try to undermine possibilities of negotiations.
Professor Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident and linguist, and Vijay Prashad.
Dissident? Noam Chomsky, a dissident? Are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. Ridiculous. He's not a dissident. Are there any countries that have that have banned him from going? I don't know. Has he been arrested or something? He's not an activist. This is unbelievable. I don't understand the cult of Chomsky that exists in the left. I mean, he's been accused of genocide denial by many people with tons of evidence supporting it. Just read his conversation with George, oh God, his name escaped, George Monbiot from The Guardian. I mean, this guy should not be on the pedestal that so many leftists have put him. He's a hack. He's an absolute campus hack. And he's not a dissident.
Prashad, director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. They've co-authored the new book, The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power. Noam Chomsky was speaking to us from Brazil. We'll play more of their interview later this week. That does it for our show.
Well, there we go. That is part 2 of Debunking Tankies, including the king of campists, Chomsky himself, and Vijay Prashad, who is definitely a tanky. Definitely a tanky. No doubt in my mind. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you take some of these debunkings and use them when you're arguing with other morally deranged tankies and campists on Twitter or Facebook or in real life. If you want to see more debunkings, follow me on Twitter, where I consistently engage with these people, perhaps more than I should. I think I'm too old for this, but yet there I am. Someone has to do it. Someone has to get dirty. So yeah, if you like this video, please like, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe to the channel, and I will do more of these videos. I'm not quite sure what's going to be my next one. Maybe I'll debunk a couple of articles that I've seen from people like Ben Burgess or Nathan Robinson. But yeah, there will be more debunking tankies. So stick around.